from the merchant's point of view more than anybody else starts to shift from the merchant owning his own fishing ships to the merchant doing what we now think of a merchant, outfitting fishermen and supplying him with fish against, supplying him with goods against the fish in the fall. From the 1715 onwards, increasingly servants are set up. People come out as youngsters, as servants, working either for a planter or a merchant. They learn the trade. If they're good and honest and sober, if they look as if they've got any likelihood at all, the merchants themselves advance some credit and they become planters. Okay? But if you're looking at it from the point of view of bettering themselves, we have another factor here. If anybody wanted to better themselves in Newfoundland from 1700 onwards, rather than slowly try to eat your way through the incredibly fluctuating fortunes of the fishery, where one year you might be ahead, but the next year you go right in the hole, because of course it's worse than agriculture. You have absolutely no control over either the markets or the catch. Anybody who felt trapped, either in the migratory fishery or as a servant to a planter, somebody who lived in Newfoundland, all you had to do was get on a boat and go down to New England, where throughout the 17th and 18th century they were absolutely starved for labour. Wages were 5 or 6 times what you could get in Newfoundland. So the servant who wants to better himself would be mad to stay in Newfoundland. If the New England boat comes up with some rum to sell, he takes passage on that in New England. They're so short of labour, they take you back for free.
You just mentioned something in the phrase a minute ago. You talked about a merchant or a planter. What exactly is the distinction there between those two categories of
Okay, there's
people?
a lot of confusion and misunderstanding.
Yeah.
The merchant is what we would now call a merchant, broadly speaking. He's the man who owns the vessels, which bring out supplies from England, which take the fish to market. He has a store where he imports from various parts of the world all the various commodities necessary that are needed in the fishery. He advances them in the spring to the fishermen, who might be by-boat keepers, the people who commute, or they might be planters, the people who live here. And in the fall, all the entries, debits in the ledgers are balanced by the fish that he collects, and then he exports the fish. That's the merchant. Now, what's a planter? It's a name which changed its meaning as time went by. This is one of the problems with it. Originally, the name planter was applied to people who left England and planted themselves in a colony. Colonies were sort of almost like gardens. You plant potatoes, well, you plant people.
Well, I suppose those people then planted potatoes.
Well, actually, not until about the 1730s. But when the term first came up in the early part of the 17th century, and it was first associated not with Newfoundland but with Virginia. In fact, if anybody who reads American history will hear talk about these rich, wealthy, slave-owning planter families from Virginia. What it meant originally was just anybody who left England and went and planted themselves in a new colony. Now, in Newfoundland, it very rapidly changed its meaning. It didn't become anybody who came to Newfoundland and lived here. It became the boat keeper, the person who came to Newfoundland, owned a house, a stage, some flakes, some land, and hired servants to carry on his fishery for him. So the planter in Newfoundland, as early as the 1660s, is not anybody living in Newfoundland. He's a sort of middle-class man. You've got the merchant here.
He's still in England.
Yes. Oh, yes. There are no merchants living in Newfoundland in the 1660s, not until the 1750s or 60s. But you have the merchant. Then you have the planter, who's the entrepreneur and manager of the catch. Nowadays, fishermen, the nearest parallel these days would be, say, the man who owns and skippers a longliner. In some cases, just like longliners now, it might be a sort of a family cooperative, where 4 or 5 brothers are all in it, although one of them's the skipper. But there are very few women and children living in Newfoundland, and hence very few families until about 1760. And thus the planter in the 1760s is more like a longliner owner-skipper now who hires men to work for him.
I see. Now, did the merchant class that eventually developed within Newfoundland itself, would that have come from the English merchant class or from the planter class, do you think?
They came both ways. Another of the myths of Newfoundland is that it was impossible to get out of debt. The planters, the fishermen, once they went into the hole, the credit system would just keep them down forever. This can be demonstrated by a myth just by looking around at a lot of the families now. If you look at various families, the Lakes were a good example. That was a planter family down in Fortune Bay. And gradually made their money upwards. Many other families, the Earls are another old merchant family who come to mind here, the same thing. It was possible, in fact, providing you were sober and didn't drink, this was, or even providing you only drank, say, a gallon a week of rum instead of a gallon a day.
Yeah.
It was perfectly possible, and there are many examples of it, for a young lad to come out from England or Ireland, aged 15 and 16, for the first 4 or 5 years he'd get no pay, he'd be apprenticed, just get his keep and food. After that, the wages were good, providing he didn't drink. Within 2 or 3 years he could be set up as a planter. If he was a good, diligent planter, he could become quite prosperous. And in certain conditions, it was perfectly possible to become a merchant. And there are the vast majority of Newfoundland merchants who we think of now over the last 100 years all started out as planters. Now, there's another group who didn't. There are some Newfoundland mercantile families who came out of the migratory fishery rather than rose up. I'm thinking here of families like the Jobs, Steers, some of the Harveys, though the other Harveys are West Indies group, Bain Johnsons. You know, these, in other words, a lot of the old Water Street merchants came out of the English, Scottish, or Irish merchant ranks and moved to Newfoundland.
Moved their headquarters. Or
yeah, Goodridge.
Part of it over
yeah,
here.
Goodridge is another example. So they come both ways.
In some cases, it would be something that a son of a merchant might do. Would be someone back in the West Country, and then one of his sons or something would come out here and set up shop in Newfoundland.
Well, the way the thing started off was this, and it continued for a long time. Until about 1800, there wasn't the clear-cut division between a merchant and planter that we have now. The planter was clear enough, but these days, the old salt fish supply merchants weren't very often engaged in the fishery themselves. You know, they stuck to the supply end and the export end. Whereas you've got to remember that there was very little settlement in Newfoundland. In 1715, for example, there were only about 1,200 people here in the winter. And thus, most of the fishing has to be carried on directly by the merchant. He has his own ships, his own inshore crews, his own boats. Benjamin Lester up in Trinity in the 1760s employed 400 or 500 men fishing directly for him. Now, he was also a merchant.
I see. So, but these men working for him were more like sort of wage earners, were they?
Oh, yes. They weren't planters. They were, you know, what Lester was, at least in the 1750s, is an enormously large planter. You know, from that, of course, he rose to become the wealthiest merchant in the Newfoundland trade. By 1790, he owned about 30 ships.
Well, how about the men that were
merchant in the Newfoundland trade? By 1790, he owned about 30 ships.
Well, how about the men that worked for him? What would their how would they be paid, and what was their standard of living?
Well,
like?
the servants were the subclass. Very few, until 1760 or 70, very few of the servants were residents of Newfoundland. They weren't born here, they didn't live here, they didn't have families here, and they most certainly didn't expect to die here, except by accident or illness or something. They were recruited annually from England and Ireland. Now, there were various ways sort of in which their service could be done. You could hire them to come over for the summer, but that was hardly worth it, since the man who recruited them had to pay their passage. So that they could be hired for, say, 2 summers and a winter. They'd arrive out here, they'd sail from Poole or Waterford in March, they'd arrive here in May, and they'd work that year right through, then they'd work in the following year's fishery, and then on the 20th of September or the 20th of October, which were the 2 traditional days for squaring up, they'd be paid off and they'd return home. As time goes on, there's a tendency to employ them for longer periods. And the young apprentices might be out here for as much as 7 summers and 6 winters before they could be released from service. Gradually, of course, as the population of Newfoundland builds up and families start expanding, some of these servants are Newfoundland born and bred. They're of families, some of the Conception Bay families where they bred like rabbits, the Frenches, the Snows, the Mercers, families like that. By 1800, you've got some French families who are planters, you know, the eldest sons or the ones who managed to make a go of it. Others, in fact, younger sons of younger sons have no land, have no capacity to get a boat. They will work for other people, so that you gradually get a servant class arising in Newfoundland itself. But that's quite late, not until from about 1760 onwards.
Well, I get the impression from some of what you're saying that perhaps another of the conventional interpretations that you would question is the kind of villain role that's been assigned to the West Country merchant in a lot of Newfoundland history. Yes.
This is not to say that many of them were not hard and in fact in some cases incredibly mean and grasping men. They were. But it's to miss the whole point. The merchant was the sole means of support for the whole colony of Newfoundland. We had no internal development, we had no internal trade one with another. The only thing which allowed people to settle in Newfoundland was fish, and the only way in which men could be brought out to Newfoundland, the only way in which supplies could be brought to Newfoundland, and the only way in which the fish could be sold abroad to return some money to enable people to continue to stay here was by means of merchants. Now, these days you might say, well, let's nationalise it.
Yeah.
But you're talking about the 18th century. The government had no role whatsoever. Didn't have the money, the means, the civil service, or anything else to organise anything like this. And thus the merchants were, like it or not, the creators of the place and the sustainers of it. And without them, there could have been no settlement in Newfoundland. Without any particular merchant, yes. But that, you just had to invent another one, if you like.
Or without merchants as a group or a class or whatever.
You had to have them.
And the settlement pattern, as it evolved, sort of spread along the coastline. Is that, you know, I remember reading in sort of high school history about how this was a response to the fears of being pressed into service and fears of pirates and fears of the French and the Beothics and so on.
Well, this is fallacious. Immediately you look at the actual population growth and then look at the logic of it. Where does settlement first start in Newfoundland? It's the Avalon Peninsula, for a variety of reasons. But where on the Avalon Peninsula do you find the early settlements? St. John's, Ferryland, Old Perlican, Bonavista, they're the headlands. Which are the areas in the Avalon Peninsula most accessible to vengeful merchants or captains or warships looking for deserters?
Right.
Exactly the same places.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. You know, if this had been the case, people would be living inland in huts or something, or at least in little inaccessible, you know, little-known harbours, where in fact the settlement is where obviously it must be. On the headlands, which is within the easiest and quickest communication one with another by sea, and of course where the fishing grounds are. The second thing is this. If a person runs away to avoid a merchant, how's he going to live? Where's he going to get his gear from? Where's he going to get his food? Who's he going to sell his fish to? You know, the idea that you could run away and lose yourself in Newfoundland and hide away is ludicrous.
Yeah. So then how do you explain the way in which it developed along the coastline, around the coastline?
It's partly political. It's to do with the 16th and 17th century situation whereby the first English colonies in Newfoundland and the first English control in Newfoundland is on the Avalon Peninsula. The rest, the English don't go to, it's controlled by the French and to some degree the Spanish. So that obviously the first English settlements take place in the middle of the English fishery.
Yeah.
They have to.
Sure.
You see, so that this is the strength of the English fishery in say, the Elizabethan times is Trinity Bay, Conception Bay and St. John's. During the early part of the 17th century, they expand a little bit south and a little bit north, so that by the 1660s, say, you can say the English dominate and monopolize, and you don't get any other nation fishing in the area between, say, Bonavista and Marrhews. So that's where the English settlement is. Then in 1713, of course, the French have to give up the south coast, and it becomes part of English Newfoundland. In fact, all of Newfoundland becomes English, but you have the French shore where settlers are not allowed to go. But that opens up the whole of the south coast, so you get settlement on the south coast. In the late 1720s, the English start spreading up into an area they shouldn't really have gone, because it's supposed to be this joint French-English area, Fogo and Twillingate. From that time onwards, settlement is a question of first of all, fishing ships go there, you know, marquetry ships. Gradually, one or two people settle there. By 1800, population pressures are becoming quite strong, especially in, say, Conception Bay, which is very heavily populated in relation to its size and opportunities in the fishery. And a lot of the northern peninsula is settled by people leapfrogging up from Conception Bay, younger sons again.
Yeah, so it's a natural sort of a spread.
Yeah, a lot of Labrador is settled by. I mean, you've got some families up there. You have men brought out from England by merchants in Ireland who work there. They marry native girls, either Inuit or Naskapi in many cases. And then some Newfoundland planters are in the Labrador fishery during the 19th century. A young lad goes up there, meets a girl, marries, settled there. This is the process.
Maybe we could just change the direction a little bit at this point. I'm just wondering now, thinking as a sociologist and looking at today's Newfoundland and trying to understand the processes and problems of Newfoundland society today, do you think there are any trends that got going early in our history, that patterns that we can see that are still important in understanding our society as it is today?
There are dozens.
Yeah.
It really is amazing. Some of them are cultural, in a sort of social, psychological sense, rather than anything concrete. But one of the big things, the big tensions in Newfoundland, right from the start, has always been this problem of what exactly are our chances for development. Right from the start, it was obvious that you could survive by catching fish, and it would make you a living. It might not make you a great living, but it would make you a living. On the other hand, it became quite obvious, by the 1670s, the West Country, there's a little rhyme running around there, were it not for wood, water and fish, Newfoundland were not worth a rush, from an economic point of view, yeah. It's quite obvious that the fishery will give you a living, and for a few, lucky few, the merchants who survive, not all of them survive, of course, bankruptcy is quite heavy, you can earn a fortune out of it. But it's limiting. And thus there's always the feeling that the fishery will give you a living, but you'll never get rich off it, you'll never become comfortable. And thus there must be something else, what I call the dream of industrial development.
Right,
Joey didn't invent it. A man called William Parkhurst in 1578 said he'd come out to Newfoundland. I don't know whether he had or not myself, but he said, in fact, judging by what he said he found, I sometimes have my doubts. But he came back absolutely convinced that there wasn't just fish in Newfoundland, that there was everything. He found pearls, or so he claimed, in Fairyland Harbour. Now, if he did, he must have picked the last batch, because I've never heard of them being found since. So that right from the start, there's always been this tension between the realization that the fishery is the absolute raison d'etre for Newfoundland. That without it there is nothing, and yet in itself it is not enough.
Yeah.
By the 1820s, once you've got a population of 60 or 70,000 people, this is becoming extreme, and people are beginning to say, look, we've got to have more than the fishery. And every generation has a dream of something else.
Yeah.
And from 1820 to about 1860, the dream was agriculture. That if only we developed our agriculture, we could become rich and wealthy and comfortable. Immigrants would flock in, develop our economy. In the 1870s, 80s and 90s, there's still agriculture, but now the tendency is to say, look at our mineral resources. Now, if only we can build a railway across the island, which will open up these areas. We can develop our mines, we can develop our lumber. People didn't know much about the interior at that stage. I mean, Murray had done a little bit of surveying, but essentially it was unknown. And people had the dream that somewhere in central Newfoundland there was a kind of Eden. A sheltered, misty valley, with grass growing 10 feet high and this type of thing. And that once the railway was built, then all of a sudden the cornucopia of wealth would be opened up to us. Yeah. So they built the railway, which was never used much for industrial development. I mean, when we did finally get lumber industries going, or mines going, of course, they didn't use the railway to ship their products anyway. All we did was spend a lot of money on the railway, which never did us much good. And then, in the 20s and 30s, you have the hum on the Humber. We do get development out of it. There's Bell Island, from which great hopes came. And in fact, for a couple of generations, 60 or 70 years, it provided several thousand men with a pretty good living. And then, of course, in Joey's day, the thing resurged again.
Yeah. This is one of the themes that I've been trying to make, actually, the way in which Joey's dream for industrial Newfoundland wasn't just something that originated with him, but it's got long roots. And
it's what you might call the Liberal Party tradition in modern politics. It's sort of being very... It's sort of fitting the thing into an awkward fitting box, perhaps. But I suppose one could say that the difference between the old Liberal and Conservative parties, insofar as there was a party difference, but a difference in the philosophy, was roughly this. The Conservatives tend to say, well, the fishery might not be much, but we've got to, we really have to develop it because it's the only thing we've got. Yeah. This was especially, of course, true of the businessmen who were Conservatives, and the merchants were generally Conservative. The Liberals have tended to say the fishery is no darn good and we've got to get it. We must have something else, otherwise our population will starve. Yeah. It goes all the way back to William Carson, right back to the beginnings of representative government, the arguments there.
Would you think that the sort of in contemporary scene, the talk about sort of Labrador as the new El Dorado and the super port and coastal Labrador is going to open up that area, and this has certain parallels with the railway back perhaps at the end of the 19th century?
Yeah, there's a sort of feeling that Newfoundland is by nature endowed to be one of the most comfortable and wealthy places to live on in this world.
Yeah.
We have all the resources. And yet, at any particular point of time, men look around and they see, in fact, that we seem to be fairly poverty-stricken, at least by any comparative standard that we make, compared to, say, Toronto now, or compared to the United States in the 1930s, or compared to Liverpool or something in the 1880s. We always seem to lose. We have all these resources. We have land which should be good for agriculture. I mean, not many people say that anymore, I mean, not comparatively speaking, but it's always been strongly felt. We have the sea swarming with fish. We have minerals in vast profusion. And in fact, we are a very mineral-rich province, there's no doubt about that. We have lumber, all these possibilities, and yet somehow or other, we're never able to exploit them. And thus you get a kind of millennialism. If only, you know, what's the explanation for this? It's some bastard from outside who always screws us. You know, we ourselves are hard-working, we live honestly, simply. We have all these resources. There can only be one explanation for why we're not wealthy.
Somebody else.
And the groups change. In the 1820s, it was the West Country merchants. By 1900, it's the Newfoundland merchants. Now it's multinational corporations, Ottawa. But somehow or other, without reflecting on whether this has got any truth in it or not, somehow or another, we always seem to both need and find an external enemy who is maliciously keeping us down.
Okay, well, turning away from that theme, how about any other patterns or traditions that you think are still of continuing importance?
Well, in the general cultural sense, of course, the dialects, the accents, the customs, when people came out and settled this society, it happened slowly. The society wasn't created overnight, although the population didn't really become self-sustaining perhaps until 1800, when you had 25,000 people here. People had been living here to some degree for a couple of hundred years almost. The unique thing about Newfoundland is that all of those people came from a confined area. They came from 2 or 3 counties down in the west of England, or 2 or 3, on the whole, 2 or 3 counties from Southern Ireland. Thus, long before they came here, they were homogeneous. Many of them were related to each other long before they even came here. The second thing which is unique about the place, and has had its impact even to this day, is that very few people came to Newfoundland intending to settle here. In the 17th and 18th century, if somebody got on a boat at Waterford or at Dartmouth and went to the West Indies or went to Boston, I mean, that was it. You'd sold up your property if you had any. You tearfully kissed your mother goodbye. You didn't expect to ever see her again. You landed at Boston, and it was a new life. Whereas in Newfoundland, the settlement is a sort of offshoot from the fishery. People, just a few people every year, just gradually decide to settle here. And thus very few of them actually ever intend to settle here. Most of them intend to go back. And thus for a couple of hundred years, you have a situation where settlement itself is regarded as very impermanent. And it really is, you've got these constant infusions and toing and froing between the areas they came from. And this continues right down until perhaps the 1820s and 30s. By that time, just about everybody who lives on Newfoundland now, their ancestors have already arrived, except for certain areas like, say, Corner Brook or Grand Falls or Goose Bay. They've already arrived, and at that stage, all immigration stops, except for a trickle. I mean, Methodist ministers and Christian brothers who are not prone to get married and found families anyway.
Technologists.
University professors, government officials, the top jobs, you might say. Immigration came to a halt, and thus you had a situation where everybody who was coming to Newfoundland had come here by 1830. Most of them had only come out in the last 30 or 40 years. You know, so they'd come out from England and Ireland at a very particular time of the evolution of the culture and economy of that area. They came out to Newfoundland, and then immigration stopped. And thus, until perhaps the Second World War, which opened it up, of course, with the vast infusions of Americans and things like that, you have a society developing which is in total isolation. It's got its own clockwork. You know, by 1930, Newfoundland is no longer like, say, the west of England. Why? Because the west of England's changed. Newfoundland has changed, but not radically. It's developed. It's developed its own traits. And thus it's become a unique society. It's not merely that the people have been living here for a long time, but it's the same people who've been living here for a long time. And this makes it, with the exception perhaps of odd places like Appalachia or remote villages in Cornwall or something like that, for a place this size, it must make it unique in the Western world. The usual parallel, of course, is Quebec, where much the same thing happened. But there they had English coming in on top of them. We never had anybody coming on top of us.
I've just been looking at some statistics comparing different cities in Canada. Of course, one of the things you do see about St. John's compared to others is the homogeneity.
Yeah.
And the other province that it's most like in that respect is Quebec, as you
That's
mentioned.
right.
So
I mean, if only the English hadn't gone into Quebec, and of course the terrific immigration, really, which has taken place into that place since 1945. Perhaps in the 1930s, Quebec would have been even more like Newfoundland than it now appears.
yeah.
You know, we haven't been swamped.
Yeah.
Most other places have.
Well, you've mentioned that most of the immigrants that came here was really fairly recent. So if we go back beyond that, you know, in the past, I'm sort of thinking in the opening remarks I made about trying to paint a portrait of what Newfoundland was like then. What, you know, in your own words, how would you describe what, say, St. John's was like? I don't know.
Well, it depends
300
on
years ago.
300 years ago, that would give us 1678.
Yeah.
Oh well, we're pretty good. We got a census return for 1679.
Good.
In that year, during the winter, about 250 people stayed behind in St. John's, so that was the population. Now, during the summer, it would go up to about 1,500 because of the visiting, the servants hired to come out to work for the summer, and above all, of course, the visiting fishing ships and the Bible keepers. But there's about 250 people living here. Of them, there are about 35 planters. These are the real residents.
I see.
You know, the people who own property. Of that 35, perhaps only 20 are married. And thus the other 15 will not stay here either. Okay? What do? Well, they fish. There is nothing else in St. John's. What do? Well, they fish. There is nothing else in St. John's at this stage. There's no government, no convoys, no garrison, no pubs, nothing at all. Each harbour in Newfoundland exists pretty much in isolation of the others, has its own independent existence every year. The only place which would have in any way been inhabited is right down on the waterfront. Agriculture, very little. I don't offhand remember the amount of livestock, but it's considerably less than 1 cow per adult. Of that 250 people, perhaps no more than 60 or 70 are real inhabitants, in the sense that they live here all the time.
Yeah.
And many of those will have gone by 1700.
In some ways, it sounds almost, if you want to look for a modern parallel, almost like a tourist town. There's a small skeletal population. In the summer, you know, lots of people come in, and then they all go again at the end.
Yes. A modern parallel is something like that. The best parallel in Newfoundland terms, it's a bit like Labrador was, say, up to the 1930s when the Newfoundland fishery died away. You know, in the 1880s and 90s, when you might have 400 or 500 schooners going up there, during the summer, the whole place would be bursting at the seams. Every island would, you know, be covered in stages. And then comes September, and they all come back to Conception Bay or St. John's. How many people are left? That's what Newfoundland
Like that,
yeah. Must have been very depressing for this, you know, to watch those ships sailing away at the end of the fishing season.
Some of the things that I've read about St. John's, and I'm not quite sure of the period, maybe, but they talk about all the drinking establishments and so on. When did that pattern get going?
Well, this begins as St. John's starts to become a different kind of place to the other settlements on the island. As I said, in 1670, St. John's is just a fishing harbour like the rest. Very good one.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's got a marvellous, completely safe harbour and all that. But essentially, that's all. The change comes during Queen Anne's War, when the government decides to put, that's from 1701. Well, it starts in 1698. But between 1698 and 1713, this war, the government establishes a garrison in St. John's. And the first pubs which survive seem to be as much to supply the soldiers with liquor. Not there are many of them, I don't know, about 57 or something. You know. And then with the convoy commander, the commander of the Royal Navy warship, which escorted the fishing fleet out both in war and peace, after 1699, he's given certain very limited powers of government over the civilian population. And he tends to because the garrison's here and half the legal problems seem to involve the garrison and the civilians as much as anything else at that time, he tends to be in St. John's. That means that the convoys in wartime which come out here tend to both come into St. John's or come just off St. John's, and then at the end of the fishing season, the ships will come in from the outports and assemble in St. John's in order to sail home, which brings in large numbers of time-expired fishermen, you know, who've been working maybe that summer or maybe even 2 or 3 years. They've got money.
They need a drink.
They've got money coming out of their pockets. So that by 1720, it's various convoy commanders are remarking that in St. John's, most of the planters, most of the inhabitants, have given up fishing. they've turned to keeping pubs. It's much more profitable for them.
Yeah.
And of course, from that time onwards, with every passing year, this tendency becomes stronger and stronger until St. John's becomes, in the 19th century, you know, by 1900, it's quite clearly the capital of most of Newfoundland.
Sure.
Everywhere else has been sucked dry.
Yeah. Okay, well, I very much appreciate the conversation. Don't want to tire you out too much here. We've been talking for a good while now. Maybe before we conclude, though, I could ask you a little bit about your own work. I mean, first, I know that when you did your doctoral dissertation, it was on Newfoundland history and West Country people and the tie between there and Newfoundland. And where have you gone since those
Oh, a long way.
days? I'm sure.
A long way. I'm now, the Maritime History Group studies fishing ships.
Yeah.
We're involved in studying everything connected with man and the sea, if you like. Not in the biological sense or ecological sense, but anything to do with shipping or fisheries on a worldwide basis. Now, the Maritime History Group is not only a group of professors, we've got a very large archive. It's probably the largest maritime history archive of old documents in the world, literally. And we're involved in very specific studies of our own. We also, of course, do research for other people every day. You know, we're in touch, I suppose, with get letters from about 10 or 12 different people around the world. Yeah. So that the Maritime History Group, which started off essentially as involved in the history of the Newfoundland fisheries from the 15th to the 18th century, has now become a rather large unit, which is interested in all matters pertaining to shipping and fisheries.
Can we expect a magnum opus coming out of the group on that first problem, the history of the Newfoundland fishery during that period?
No, I don't think so. Things move on and one doesn't have time. Bits come out. Anybody wants to read about that, better read my thesis.
Sure. How about your own particular involvement, your own research interests right now?
Well, at the moment, they're connected with the Canadian shipping industry in the second half of the 19th century. We're looking at the question of how it rose. In the 1880s, it was the third or fourth largest shipping nation in the world in terms of ownership of vessels in deep-sea trade. Nowadays, I don't know, we've got 3 or 4. We seek, the whole group's involved in this. We're trying to understand how the thing grew.
How it grew,
and how it died.
Right.
And my particular interest at this moment of time is in American ships involved in the